Welcome to the CASAS Remote Sit Test Training webinar. I'm Portia Latherla.
And I'm Lori Howard.
We're going to be presenting this training today that we developed along with Selenir Flag. We're excited you're listening to this webinar and hope you leave the webinar today feeling confident in being able to administer remote citizenship interview tests or SIT tests. Let's look at our goals and objectives for this training. The goal for our training today is for SIT administrators and those in the process of becoming SIT certified to be able to give the SIT test remotely. To that end, by the end of this training, you'll be able to identify the agreements that you and or your agency will need to sign before beginning SIT remote testing. You will also be able to identify and implement the procedures or steps you must take to effectively administer the SIT remotely. And lastly, by the end of this training, you will be able to identify the tools that will assist you in giving the SIT remotely. Here is our agenda for this training. First, we will give you an overview of remote SIT testing. What are the benefits and what are some challenges that you might encounter? You will also learn about the additional requirements needed to administer the SIT remotely and about the tools that will assist you with the remote testing. Let's now look at an overview of SIT remote testing, beginning with the benefits. In considering the benefits, the option to test remotely is something the field has been asking for a long time. Agencies have wanted a remote testing option for distance learning students and to be able to catch up with students who have left a program without a post-test. Agencies now have the opportunity to build the remote testing capacity by establishing procedures and training staff. Among the benefits of testing in general is the ability for students and teachers to see their progress. Remote testing can help you keep your students engaged in learning. And for students preparing for the USCIS test, the citizenship interview test is especially helpful. The SIT test is a great practice for students who are preparing for their USCIS interview, so having the option of SIT remote testing is really useful to be able to continue to help them when we can't meet with them face-to-face. More generally, the ability to test remotely is the wave of the future for distance learning. Remote testing does present some challenges. These are some of them. Not all students or even teachers have access to the appropriate technology. There may be problems with internet access as well. Students may not have a quiet or a private environment, and they may have distractions during testing. Remote testing also creates some test security and privacy issues for the agencies. For example, how will you identify the student? Where will you securely store the testing materials when you're not working at your school? You'll also need to obtain and document verbal agreements for test security from your students. Now, all of you have already learned how to administer the citizenship interview test. Many of you have been doing it for years. What you will learn today are the requirements that will be added to SIT test administration. The first requirement is to complete this SIT remote test training. Alternately, a SIT test administrator can be trained by another SIT administrator who has completed SIT remote testing. So once you have completed this training, you can train other SIT administrators at your agency. The second requirement concerns delivery modifications. In addition to following the SIT test administration directions from your certification training, you must also follow the SIT remote testing guidelines. And thirdly, there are 3 levels of remote testing agreements. The first is the agency remote testing agreement. 1 is required per agency. The second is the proctor remote testing agreement. 1 is required per SIT administrator. And you need a verbal student agreement given at the time of testing. Your agency and you as a SIT test administrator are responsible for ensuring test security for remote testing. You can find these documents at the California Remote Testing page on the CASAS website. At the end of the training, we'll have a slide about accessing all the documents that we mentioned in the training. So far, we have looked at the benefits and challenges of remote testing and the requirements. Now let's look at implementing SIT remote testing. The first and most important thing you need to know about SIT remote testing implementation is that the existing SIT test administration directions in the SIT training apply, unless specifically noted otherwise in the SIT remote testing guidelines. Later, we'll be showing you the cover of the SIT remote testing guidelines and where you can get them. The SIT testing remote guidelines do not change anything about how you read the test questions to the examinee or how you score the answers. Now, Lori will explain further how you need to prepare for giving the SIT remotely.
Thanks, Portia. We've set up the system such that at least one person from each agency must complete remote SIT test training. And this is the training that you're in now. If there are multiple SIT administrators at your agency, they can all take the training, or you or another SIT administrator can train them. The bottom line is that everyone doing SIT remote testing needs to be trained. If you want to review the steps of preparing for and implementing SIT remote testing, or if you want to train someone else, you can use the one-page overview of SIT remote testing procedures called Going Remote, Checklist for SIT Test. And you can also use the SIT remote testing guidelines to assist you in the training. You can find this recorded training, the slides for this training, the Going Remote checklist, and the SIT remote testing guidelines, as well as all the documents we're going to mention today, at the California Remote Testing page on the CASAS website. Now we're going to talk about remote testing options. After SIT administrators are trained, the first step in preparing to do remote testing is to determine the most accessible and most secure remote technology and procedures for SIT testing. All the SIT administrators at your agency should consult together with your coordinator or administrator to determine the technology and procedures that would work best with your students and work best with your agency. You should ask yourselves, which remote platforms are accessible to my students? Which are accessible to the SIT administrators at your agency? And which are the SIT administrators most familiar with? Will you select the smartphone with camera or a computer with webcam and phone? Or do you want to use both? Maybe some administrators use one and some using the other. Another consideration are the test booklets. Will your SIT administrators have access to CASAS paper SIT test booklets for both forms 973 and 974? One of our gung-ho SIT administrators took home some paper tests with her when school closed, but most of us didn't have that foresight. So if you don't have paper tests, you'll have to have the SIT administrators access the CASAS fillable PDF SIT test booklets that CASA is making available. We will tell you how to access these at the end of the training. So again, some SIT administrators could use print tests if they have them, and others could use fillable PDFs. Your agency can use both types of tests, and these are the types of issues you should discuss before making a determination. So as we said, the SIT test delivery can be modified for remote testing on either computers or smartphones. The key requirement is for the SIT administrator to be able to see and interact with the student live in real time. This will most accurately simulate the face-to-face testing situation we usually have when test administrators and students can be in the same room. Here are some of the remote testing platforms that you can choose from. We suggest that you choose the one that is most accessible and familiar to you and your students. Of course, some training and practice using these platforms may be involved for both SIT administrators and students. Once you have determined the delivery mode or modes you will use and the type of test forms you will use, your agency needs to access online, complete, and submit the remote agency testing agreement. The agency will select from the different types of test series the agency will be doing remotely. This could include CASAS pre-post testing or COAPs. Since your agency has decided to do the CIT or citizenship interview test, be sure to check that box, and you can see that box with a blue arrow next to it. If you also want to give your citizenship preparation students the remote government and history test for citizenship, you'll need to look at the general CASAS remote testing guidelines, which you can find on the California remote testing page on the CASAS website. On the agency remote testing agreement, you'll also be able to select the test booklet modes and delivery modes you'll be using for your remote SIT testing. One thing your agency is promising in the agreement is to not record remote testing sessions. However, as you know from your SIT training, you may want to record your test administration session to help you refine your scoring and refer to anchors after the test is administered. SIT certifiers must also record 2 interview sessions in order to complete certification. The asterisk at the bottom of this page of the form exempts SIT administrators from the no recording policy. Portia will talk a little bit more about this later and about getting permission from the students to record. There's another agreement that needs to be signed, as Portia mentioned earlier. At least one person from each agency needs to complete remote SIT testing training. Each agency needs to ensure that SIT administrators have been trained in remote testing and security measures. And then each person who's trained needs to sign the Proctor Remote Testing Agreement. And then once it's signed, that agreement is kept on file at the agency. As with all the other documents, you can find this Proctor Remote Testing Agreement at the California Remote Testing page at CASAS.org. Now let's move on to the procedures for SIT remote testing. Once your agency has determined how you will implement SIT remote testing, the agency needs to update the Local Assessment Policy, or LAP. What you will be adding is your agency's remote testing policy, all the ways you plan to administer the SIT and other remote tests. This can just be an additional page describing who and how you are going to test remotely. Your agency should already have local assessment policy on file, which can be added to. But in case you need to have a copy of the LAP, you'll be able to link to a copy of it on the remote testing page. Those of you who are in process of certifying to become a SIT administrator, if your agency is not going to do any other type of remote testing, you don't need to ask your agency to revise the local assessment policy. Before you begin remote testing, it's really important to practice with the technology. Each administrator who's going to do remote testing should learn the technology and then practice with 1 or 2 colleagues or friends or family members before administering the first test remotely with a student. And then you may need to practice a little bit with the student to make sure that student is comfortable. Once the SIT administrators feel ready to give the test remotely, they can schedule the remote testing with those students at the agency who have completed their citizenship preparation and are ready to take the test. So now that we've discussed how to prepare for remote SIT testing, Portia will discuss administering the test.
Thank you, Lori. All right, so administering the test remotely. Now that you're ready to give the test, you will administer either the Form 973 or 974 following the SIT test administration directions, or TAD, and the SIT remote testing guidelines. You'll find the guidelines on the California remote testing page at CASAS.org. Once again, please note that the existing SIT test administration directions in the SIT certification training apply unless specifically noted otherwise in the SIT remote testing guidelines. Also note that the SIT test administration is a one-on-one test. No group testing is permitted. And as usual, when giving the test, you will score the student's performance in the test booklet, either on a paper booklet or on a fillable PDF. Remember from your SIT training that these test booklets must be kept secure. Contact sit@casas.org if you need the fillable PDF booklet for SIT test administration and scoring. When you administer the SIT test remotely, you need to ensure the security of the test environment. The first step is to confirm the test taker's identity. So if you know that student, you can visually confirm. If not, the student could, for example, show you an ID that has the student's name and photo through a camera. Have the student use a cell phone or other video camera to show the room to make sure there's no one there to assist them during the test, or that there are no notes or other items that are not appropriate during testing. In the next slides, we'll review the language you need to use for this verbal or visual confirmation. In every case, the examinee must agree to the security agreements, or you cannot proceed with the SIT remote test. Here are some excerpts from the SIT remote testing guidelines. As you can see, the guidelines provide you with a script that you can follow. You have the option to record the SIT interview if you get permission from the examinee before you record. It can be really helpful to record your test administration sessions to help you refine your scoring and to give you time to refer to anchors after the test is administered. If you want to record, be sure to follow this script to get verbal permission to record and mark it on the booklet, if that's applicable. If you're in the process of initial certification, you must send 2 recorded interviews to CASAS, one Form 973 and one Form 974, in order to complete your SIT certification. Here are a few more questions from the guidelines. You must ask these questions. So, is there anybody else in the room? Will you take the test by yourself? You cannot use notes, books, or computers to find answers. Do you agree? You cannot share any test questions or answers. Do you agree? These scripted questions guide you in getting verbal confirmation that the student will observe the remote testing security guidelines. After you administer the SIT exam, submit the test results to the data person at your school. The TE data person will need to check a box in TE that indicates the test was given remotely. Your agency needs to develop a process for securely storing remote testing materials, either the paper tests, the PDFs, or both. As a reminder, the CDE requires that the records, including SIT test booklets, be stored for 3 years, plus the current year for auditing purposes. All of the steps we just talked about to prepare for and administer SIT remote testing are summarized in this document called the Going Remote Checklist for SIT Test. As with all the documents we mentioned, you can find it on the California Remote Testing page at the CASAS website. Now, Lori will tell you about the remote testing guidelines and tools.
So here's the cover of the SIT remote testing guidelines that have been prepared for you to follow. It includes all the information we've covered today in the training and much more. So we hope you'll take a good look at that. You can find all of the documents and agreements we've talked about today, as Portia said, on the California Remote Testing page on the CASAS website at www.casas.org. The print test booklets can be ordered by your agency as usual on the CASAS website. If you want to use the PDF test booklets, please email your request to sit@casas.org. Remember that all test booklets must be kept secure, so that is why the fillable PDF forms can't be posted on the California Remote Testing site. Once you receive the print booklets from your agency or the PDF testing booklets, you must keep them secure at your remote location until your agency can secure them in a locked cabinet or in a secure digital format. When you have completed SIT remote testing with your students, we would love your feedback. We invite you to share your and your students' experiences or make suggestions on how SIT remote testing can be improved. You can give us your feedback or ask questions by contacting sit@casas.org. So we've come to the end of our training and we want to review the goals and objectives we had for today. We hoped that by the end of this training, you would be able to give the SIT test remotely, and that you would be able to identify the agreements necessary for SIT remote testing, identify and implement the procedures necessary for effective SIT remote test implementation, and identify the tools that will assist you in appropriate SIT remote test implementation. We appreciate you participating in this training, and we know that this is a new process for all of us, and we all need to learn how to do remote testing effectively. We realize that there may be a learning curve for all of us before we feel comfortable with this new mode of testing for our learners. Now that you've finished the training, we hope you'll reflect on what steps you need to take now to implement CIT remote testing. For example, you could ask yourself, who will you talk to about completing the agency remote testing agreement? If your agency will be doing CIT remote testing for your students in general, not just to get your CIT certification, who will update your local assessment policy? And how will you decide the best technology to use with your CIT prep students? Also, it would be a great idea if you would survey your teachers and students about CIT remote implementation once you've completed a few rounds of CIT testing. In the spirit of continuous improvement, you always want to evaluate any new strategies, and a survey of CIT administrators and CIT students could help you make any needed adjustments in the remote testing. So Portia and I are really pleased that you joined us today for this CIT remote testing training, and we hope you found it helpful.
Thank you for attending, and good luck with CIT remote testing.